Welcome to another episode of My Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I reach out into the universe and I find people who inspire me and I corner them into being on this so that they can inspire and motivate you. And I'm especially pleased to have today's guest. Do you ever run into someone who is so smart, it's painful? And I mean good painful. I mean, you hear it and you don't know what to do other than just uh, just appreciate it. And what I love about Marty Nemko, and he doesn't often hear the word love, but I'll say it. What I love about Marty Nemko is his ability to distill and cut through to the essence of a problem, convert it into something that's practical and tactical and doable. Of course you have to have a little bit of a commitment beyond just venting and kvetching, that you really want to get better. And one of the things I've always appreciated about Marty is after he'll share something, he's incredibly respectful. He invites you to weigh in, and he'll say, what do you think of that? How does that fit? Um, Also, before he gets on, he's gotten a bum rap in the world. He is smart, articulate, direct, and he doesn't have a hurtful bone in his body, but he does like to speak the truth as he sees it. And uh, I'm hoping as you hear from him, hear what he has to say, that you can help me because his directness, which is not hurtful at all, flirts with the cancel culture. And I think it's an injustice. So let me tell you a little bit about it. He writes too much. 13 books, 4,000 articles, including in Time, Washington Post, almost 2,000 in Psychology Today alone. U.S. News called him a career coach extraordinaire. He doesn't like the term career coach because it feels so lightweight. That's just a teaser of what we're in store for. He got his PhD from UC Berkeley, but he believes he learned more practical value from his clients, Googling, and his father, which we haven't talked much about, and I've known him for several years. And he shares my belief in the cosmic justice of giving away as much as possible.
Yep.
And Marty has so much to give away. And if you're listening in, this is one of my guests that you should take notes on this episode. And I wouldn't mislead you, my listeners. So Marty, welcome.
Well, you're very kind. I will try to live up to those very generous words.
Well, there's no puffery in that. It's all accurate. But I will say to you something that I do say to all my guests is if you could step back and take a 10,000-foot view, you might say, Mark is precisely as Mark, I don't need 10,000 feet. Give me 300 feet. I got the view down. But
Mhm.
what is your view of if one is to have a purpose or a calling or what you're here to do, that is sort of the essence of what you're giving to the world and why?
I do believe that materialism is overrated. Of course, poverty isn't fun, but I really believe that the life well led is defined by spending as many moments as possible using your best skills, whether genetically and or environmentally created, to make the biggest difference in the world that somebody else wouldn't. So you talk about my flirting with the cancel culture. I have many liberal views. For example, I'm very pro-choice. I'm not materialistic. I'm very pro-gay marriage, all those kind of things. But occasionally, not all wisdom resides left of center. And so I choose to write occasionally about things that are not part of the current orthodoxy. And so my best skills are writing, thinking, and counseling. And so using my best skills to make a difference that no one else would means writing about things that are not the conventional wisdom. Because if I write about being pro-choice, I'm a grain of sand on a beach. So I occasionally, and I don't just write to be contrarian, I'm not a provocateur, but occasionally I feel that life is well led to the extent to which you use your best skills doing something that other people wouldn't.
I really like that you've said that, I think 3 times, doing something that other people wouldn't, doing something that that people wouldn't even think to do. Recently, I heard a fellow named Bill Ryan. Bill Ryan was a marketer with, he helped launch Yahoo and helped launch Steve Jobs Part 1, Part 2. So when Steve Jobs was at Apple and then left and came back, and he shared this interesting uh, observation about Steve Jobs, but I think it could apply to you. He said Steve Jobs had the ability to identify problems that people didn't know they had. Instead of just the problems they think they have, he is able to see, Steve Jobs was able to see a problem that people didn't know they have. And the benefit of that for Steve Jobs, and I think if you listen to Marty, he's got the same skill, is with Steve Jobs. When you can identify a problem that people didn't know they had, and what was that problem? When he was growing up, only geeks like computers and technology, who needs a shower, all that sort of stuff. But he knew technology and computers weren't going away, but they had to be more simple, more portable, maybe more elegant, maybe more fun. And people didn't even know they had that problem, because when other people were going to the senior prom, he was going to Radio Shack and Heathkit. So I would add, because I think in my interaction with you, you will often see something, not to be contrarian, but you'll just see something that is so obvious to you that other people don't see it. So can you unpack that and where you learn to be able to, and give some examples of things that are hidden in plain sight, that once someone tries it on, tastes it, gives it the respect of thinking about it, it just makes so much sense. So can you give some examples of that? And then what were the wake-up calls? Where'd you learn that from? You mentioned your father I mentioned it in the introduction. So talk to us.
I have to say, I don't know where I learned it from. I did grow up in poverty, new immigrants, Holocaust survivors. My parents spoke little English. They had no education. My education was all just plain old Bronx and Flushing, Queens public schools and Queens College. Um, I just think it's built into my DNA. But a couple of examples of where I think maybe there are some observations I've had that are important yet under discussed. One is micro and one is macro. Micro meaning it pertains to each individual, and that is, I think we have moved to where people suffered from paralyzing lack of self-confidence to where too many people have excessive self-confidence. Their self-confidence exceeds their competence. And so they may be loud and proud and are damn sure about what they believe, and in fact will squash, cancel culture, whatever, censor the views that differ. So I would encourage people to recognize that all wisdom does not reside left nor right of center, but to realize that wisdom comes from exploring the full marketplace of ideas and then coming to a tentative conclusion, because very rarely are things absolutely right or absolutely wrong. The ability to understand other perspectives is a crucial micro thing, something that each and every one of us, I think, would be wise to do. If you're a reader of the New York Times, you could do worse than to read the Wall Street Journal in addition, for example. The more macro issue is, I think, education has long been ripe for reinvention. We still teach functionally the way we have for thousands of years, sage on the stage, or we'll let the kids do these little group projects together with minimum supervision and with little structure as to what needs to be prerequisite learning. So what counts as each kid's opinions without really having a great deal of foundation. And teachers, some are magnificent, some are terrible. and some are the vast majority, like in most normal distributions, are somewhere in the middle. I believe that the single most potent way we could both help the best and brightest as well as reduce the achievement gap is what I call ultra courses. Take one course, for example, algebra. It's taught by the full panoply of teachers, good, bad, and indifferent. And we know it's a difficult subject, considered a gateway subject for college. What if, imagine this, imagine that we brought together 3 or 4 of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics Teacher of the Year Award winners, put them in a room, say, let's divide up the introduction to algebra course. Let's put them in a room with a computer gamification expert from electronic arts and create the ultimate online interactive video course. That way, everybody from Maine to where you live in Southern California, rich or poor, Beverly Hills to Harlem, could get world-class instruction. Or at minimum, make that instead of the homework assignments, which are due pages 333 to 336, the odds, instead have them experience these amazing modules, these mini lessons by this dream team of instructors. That to me is an example of an under-considered macro issue that I think is a slam dunk for greatly improving humankind. What do you think?
I think you just did it again. There was the what do you think respect that Marty shows. I think it's not just smart, it's brilliant. It's brilliant because it's so doable. I guess if you're listening into this, Marty comes up with solutions to complex problems that are so doable, but he runs into the not invented here problem. He runs into the hubris, which is hubris is actually fear of change disguised as overconfidence. And if you could just replay what he suggested or timestamp it and share it with people you know in education, it's just one of the many things that Marty has to share with the world that would help the world.
I think some of it's my fault. I paid a price. I've chosen to opt for the freedom of self employment, thereby sacrificing the power that comes from being affiliated with a prestigious organization. And I think that's part of the reason that ideas like, ultra classes have, even though I've really tried, I've reached out to powerful people all over the state and even in the country and gotten nowhere. I'm wondering whether, again, maybe it's and I've tried to say that I want to work with the unions on this because it is terrifying to them to think they might lose jobs. That's why I offered the version that is make it just homework so that it saves work for the teachers so that they don't have to assign homework. They're getting, and it could be auto-corrected, online. Um, but it's to no avail. I think some of it, maybe the idea isn't as good as I think it is. Maybe I'm guilty of hubris here, but maybe it is something to do with my choices of having chosen to be unaffiliated and therefore having lost a great deal of connections and prestige.
Well, let's play with it because uh, I've recently made a discovery. I haven't even shared this with Marty, and Marty and I are in regular contact. Uh, for a number of years now, I've been focused on programs to prevent suicide. It's epidemic, and we're worried it's going to increase. And here's the observation I finally made, and it was just staring at me, but I failed to see it, is that one of the reasons people aren't interested in suicide prevention programs, at least the ones that I offer, which is built on a career of being relatively effective as a suicide prevention expert, is what I realized is people don't really care about suicide because if someone dies by suicide, it only affects them and their family. And people roll the dice hoping they won't become one of those families, because if you become one of those families, you enter into that fraternity, sorority, that group you never wanted to be a part of, which is parents who have lost children to suicide. But I realized that it was too dark. But here was the pivot, and I would love to see if we can do that with what you propose. What I realized is the same measures to prevent a child from acting inward with self-destructive, the same measures to prevent that by parents, the exact same steps will also prevent a child from growing up to act outward as in violence. And the potential of your angry teenager, the one that they called the cops on, the one you wonder is a little antisocial, the one you wondered who could uh, cause violence. Um, there's more interest in that because violence can affect any of us towards us. But it's fascinating because the exact same program, which I can't even get arrested for on suicide prevention, uh, as I've pivoted to violence prevention, oh, suddenly they're interested. So, what I would throw back at you is if we use that pivot, what is it that would scare the whole institution of education, especially in STEM, because it seems so many Americans are intimidated by that, unless they tend to be born a little bit on the spectrum and they love engineering type stuff. But what could scare Americans enough to say we got to do something about it? You know, would there be data that says X% of our jobs went to blah 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 blah? Looks like, if you, no offense, if you're an American, your kid's going to be unemployed or working for some. I don't know what it is, but maybe there's a way to pivot it just to get people's attention.
I do think that, of course, we live in an era where perhaps the ultimate megatrend is a focus on race and gender. And so, of course, in pitching it, you don't pitch it as this would be great for gifted kids. That's the opposite of where we're focused these days. But it would be on closing the achievement gap around race and gender. And I think that also applies to your situation. As it happens, I think, I know that the suicide rate is far greater for boys and men than it is for girls and women. And that difference has accelerated, perhaps because of all the attention where men and white men are seen as privileged. You know, their achievements are not their own, but a function of privilege, that they're oppressors, and so they're feeling worse. And that seems to, I'm guessing that that's exacerbating the gap between suicides and not. So I think part of the reason that people are shrugging their shoulders at your suicide stuff is because it's not couched as women and minorities are disproportionately committing suicide. In fact, in middle age, white males are the fastest growing or the largest, I don't recall, committers of suicide. You probably know better than me. So I think, in today's world, it's critical to couch things in terms of benefits to women and minorities. What's your reaction?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And you're right. And things need to be couched in that. Let me ask you something, because we've had offline these conversations. Uh, See, part of the program that my team and I have developed to prevent frustrated teenagers or young children growing up into angry, hostile, antisocial, violent young adults is really being able to have parents model on a daily basis within their families. The whole idea is people would share something that they were each frustrated by and share what was their immediate impulse. Because see, what happens is when people get frustrated, they immediately either go to anxiety, panic, or anger, violence. I mean, there's no pausing, there's no reflection, there's no lengthening the time to pause with an impulse. And I'm just thinking, with families, disadvantaged families who may have this built into them, uh, we just can't learn STEM. We're just not smart enough, because the parents felt that way. Well, maybe there's a way for families to, and this is part of the program we've produced, maybe the families can share every day something that each person felt frustrated about, you know, and then pause, what was your impulse before you got angry and made it worse, or you got afraid and you panicked? And it also, as we're developing it, it will also increase the bonding in families. And guess what? The bondings between husbands and wives. to be able to just share, what was one thing, we were frustrated about. And so, but you're right, what's going to grab the attention right now is, it has to somehow impact women and minorities to even get attention, and that anything that seems to be white male is being marginalized.
The notion of an open family conversation was more de rigueur when families had dinner together every night. So it didn't need to be a separate meeting.
That's
But
right.
today, with so many single parent families and where both parents are working and they don't come home at the same time, they're asynchronous. There are fewer opportunities. But a nice way to bolt on your idea is to build it into whenever it doesn't need to be every day. But, for example, trying to tie all this together, one of the core frustrations that bright kids have, and a lot of the mass shooters were not dumb kids. I think about Dylan Klebold or whatever in Colorado. These were very bright kids. They may have been troubled, but they were very bright. And, somebody, although I'm a career counselor, mainly my PhD is in the evaluation of education. And so I think a lot about education. My wife's a superintendent of schools in Napa County. So we think a lot about education. Well, one of the frustrations that bright kids have of all races and genders are full, it's not binary anymore. The continuum of gender is the dissolution of ability group classes. Classes are now, in an attempt to make things more equal, they have largely abandoned ability group classes, especially K-8 and even in some of the high schools. So a bright kid is sitting stultified and frustrated. And, that's not the sole, certainly it's not the sole cause of somebody, becoming violent, but it's contributory. It's always multiple factors. So I worry that a negative side effect of our having eliminated ability group classes ends up stultifying the bright, because they're sitting bored listening to the teacher having to meet the needs of all kids. And it frustrates the slow, because they are seeing that no matter how hard they work, they may never achieve as much as that super bright kid. So one of the unfortunate negative side effects of this attempt at egalitarianism, the ability of mixing everybody together in the same class, could be this increase in violence, even suicide. I'm curious what you think about that.
Oh, I'm in total agreement. And I think that could be in sync with something I suggested, because the frustration of a bright kid being stultified by a dilution of what their ability is, the being able to express the frustration about it, and being able to have a conversation. Well, what are the options? What are the things? We have access to being online, but to start with frustration, or the frustration with the kid who's not that bright academically, with thinking maybe I'm just stupid. But so the idea is to catch the frustration, and to make that have frustration as the primacy. And the reason being is, what I've discovered is, people will talk about being frustrated. It's a safer thing than to say to someone, you seem upset, you seem angry. People immediately get defensive because it feels like you're accusing them. But I think the word frustration is so ubiquitous. I think what you do is you open up, well, what is, to the bright kid, so what is so frustrating about sitting in a class in which you understand everything in 10 minutes and the class takes an extra hour that you have to sit there? Or to the kid who's just not getting it, what's so frustrating that within 10 minutes you think to yourself, there's absolutely no way, I can't follow a word that the teacher's saying. But you draw from them that, so it calms down the agitation. And the agitation is what leads to the impulsivity and the acting out.
Lest we be reductionistic and ascribe too much causality to education as being the problem, I think also about how many people have committed suicide because of love loss. They fell in love with somebody and got rejected. Or how many of those middle-aged people we discussed earlier commit suicide because they lost their job and they feel they're hopeless. How many people at any stage in life, whether they're teenagers or young adults or older people, say, I don't know what the hell I was supposed to do with my life career-wise. And so they feel aimless, empty, unwanted, unneeded by the professional world, because they may be just generically skilled. They may have soft skills. I'm a people person. I'm organized. I'm kind. And the world is an era of specialization. We're in an era of specialization where employers want somebody with, those soft skills, but also great technical skills, whatever. So you've got this huge percentage of people I don't know if it's 20, 30, 40, 50, who are feeling this, as the sociologists used to say, anomie, a sense of alienation. Where the hell do I fit? And you combine that with perhaps other frustrations like money. If poverty is not a good thing. And it's frustrating if you don't have health care, or you're worried about whether you can afford your medication or have to split it in half. All those factors are contributory to suicide. And if we're really going to have an intelligent response to it, it really needs to be full dimension, even though it feels overwhelming to try to deal with all that. What do you think?
No, I totally agree with that. Something I will share, I think I've shared this with you. So when I was focused more on suicide prevention, which I'm still doing, there was someone who reached out to me, Jason Reed. His 14-year-old son died by suicide. And he actually did a Goalcast video to 14 male founders. And he basically said he felt it was his fault that his son died by suicide. And what he basically said is, and they found one of the suicide notes was the passcode to the computer, and his son had been looking for ways to kill himself for months. And what Jason owned up to these high-powered, most, I think, male entrepreneur founders, is he said, I made it impossible for my son when he was feeling bad to talk to me about it because I'm an entrepreneur. I give solutions. So I give him solutions. Plus, I've failed many times. I've had scary times, but as the dad, I don't share that with my family. I'm the man. So my son felt doubly alienated because he's looking at a dad who gives him solutions and a dad who doesn't seem to have any vulnerability. And so he felt increasingly isolated. And so, and one of the things that Jason told me, which has, I wouldn't say haunted me, but stayed with me, is he said, what he realized is when you speak to someone, you speak to your teenager and say, how are you doing? And they say, I'm great. They're usually good. But if they say, I'm fine, they're not. They just want you off their back. They don't want to talk about it. And so what he was sharing in this Goalcast video is we need to find a way of being more open and inviting them to express how they feel, even though that's foreign to us as problem solvers. And he actually created a documentary called Tell My Story, because that was the other suicide note that his son left, and he wants to honor that last wish. So I agree with you. Yeah, it needs to be multifactorial. But as I can tell you from my suicide prevention work, every time I started trying to check all the boxes of the multifactorial thing, what I noticed with my suicidal patients is they would smile at me in a way that says, I'm stuck here. I can't go to where you're suggesting. You have to find me. And it was only when I was just curious about finding them. I didn't have to have a solution. Just going where they were, they were able to sort of feel the relief of not feeling alone, and they'd start to cry with relief. So I agree with everything you're saying, and you're a great problem solver. And from a macro level, yes, we need to address all those things. But in the meantime, we have mentioned suicide. There's still an increasing number of people that are just not just falling through the cracks, they're diving through them.
I want to comment a little bit about this. Of course, if looking back, if we're looking at some pool of people who are suicidal, I'm sure the parents say, I wish I was more open and listening and not just accepting, how are you? Fine. But there is actually a downside as we were saying earlier, that most things are not black and white. If you're talking prospectively, a group of thousands or millions of people or whoever is listening to this, there is a downside of encouraging open communication. Sometimes not. I have seen too many people, frankly, who've had a lot of therapy, who have revisited and revisited their issues, their traumas from past, from childhood or from marriage or whatever, so much that they become more unhappy, less efficacious people, because top of mind for them is all of that past trauma, or even a current trauma that they can't do anything about. Sometimes the right answer is to not bring everything out, but there are I know somebody who is very mentally healthy, and she says that the key to her mental health is being the queen of denial. If she can't do something about it, she suppresses it consciously and distracts herself. And net, that makes her a happier person than if she followed the common dictum to process, explore your feelings. So I think it needs a nuance. What do you think?
Uh, See, to our listeners, this is why I love conversations with Marty, because it makes us more accurate and more helpful, hopefully, to people who listen to whatever we have to say. I agree with you that endless processing is analogous to endless rumination.
Right.
But if it's always tied to, uh, and one of the things that when I was practicing, I'm retired, is I would take people back. There was actually an approach I did, which was kind of interesting, where I would take people back to a time when they were younger, when they acted out, in sort of a negative, destructive way, but they didn't get caught. So if they got caught, then the memory is complicated with social workers, police.
Right.
And so they go back because when they acted out, it was a way of expressing anger at the world. And many of them felt ashamed at those, still felt ashamed of what they did. They just weren't caught. But what would happen is when we go back to it, uh, and we dig down, what was underneath the anger, what was below it that either frightened you, frustrated you, or something, and you resorted to anger because there seemed to be no option. And when they're able to see that, it somehow reconfigures it. And then at that point, it helps them eliminate a little bit of the shame and then say, going back there at that moment when you acted out, which has given you a lifetime of shame that you vandalized such and such, but you never got caught. Right at that moment, what would have been a better decision? So you go into the re-experiencing it as opposed to processing ad infinitum, but you pivot it once they're there. What would have been a better choice? And actually, in the experience of this, I'm kind of sharing my approach. Is sometimes what they'll say is finding someone to talk to the way you just talked to me.
That makes good sense to me, Mark.
And then and what happens is, so they re-experience it without processing it, but when they can say, oh, it was hurt, fear underneath it all that drive it, I'm not such a shameful person that I vandalized these buildings, but the hurt and fear underneath it all, that's what I didn't realize was connected to it. And then, okay, what would have been a better thing? So we're just, this is how Marty and I work together. We share things, and I'm so glad that we're on this together, because we hope, I think I speak for both of us, that if anyone's listening into this and has listened this far into this particular episode, I hope you learn from our dialogue, and I hope it's a model for the dialogues you can be having with people in your family, and how this kind of dialogue versus a debate, we're not being disrespectful towards each other. He's not sort of saying, I think you're really out of whack. He shares his analysis of it. It's so, as I said, painfully clear and smart. I hear it. I'm not taking exception to it. I'm he's hitting me a serve, and I'm returning the serve, and we're volleying.
Yep.
So this is great. So talk more about if we could imagine a life in which you're just speaking as clearly and prescriptively as you can. Imagine a life in which any of the negative reactivity that you have unjustly received were taken away. I guess you just keep writing, and what would happen is you'd be able to see that people are benefiting from what you're suggesting, and you'd get to be able to sit back and say, maybe I helped the world a little bit. But if you could imagine this unjust reaction uh, to to you, what would you see?
Well, there are just certain topics that are third rail. I really do think that in the cancel culture, unless you speak the orthodoxy, basically, regarding um, uh, victimization, systemic racism, sexual inequality, preaching the desirability of equal outcomes, disparate impact, which is that's the disparate impact theories. I can't write about that with undue. I have gotten threats and attacks, not just myself. There's one person. I really only have one troll, and it's just, I'm quite confident it's a she. She's very clever about being anonymous, but she is. I'm a human being, and I don't have a very thin skin, but I've got a moderate skin. And after she's been very persistent with this and attempting to twist my words, distort things, not only about me, but my wife. So, I can't write about that stuff. That's just not real. I'm not so interested in thinking about if I lived in a world that didn't exist. That's the world we live in today. And so I'm grateful that I'm still able to write counsel and speak about much. I just have to avoid what are today, for me, third world topics, third rail topics, excuse me. So I know that you wanted to keep things to 40 minutes or so. So
No, we're fine. So if you're listening in, Marty Nemko has deserves, because he's earned the right to be listened to and heard and considered. He's not telling anybody to do anything. Even in this interview, he hasn't told me to do anything. He looks at a situation, he comes up with some astute, practical observation, and even steps that can be taken. He shares them. He's not pushing them down my throat or your throat. So I hope if you're listening to this, that you'll be able to share this episode with other people, because he really deserves to be listened to and heard, and we can help him. And if you're listening in and you're one of our subscribers, I would personally be grateful if you did that for Marty.
you said you were in a rush. I would like your opinion about. I I, I have a sense of where we're headed. I'm mainly a career counselor. Where I think we're headed in terms of the world of work. Do we have time to talk about that?
Yeah. No. This is variable. It can be. We
Okay.
have time.
So it seems to me there are these inexorable trends that are not going to be reversed, and that is automation, uh, global economy in which employers to stay in business are going to get the labor as cheaply as they can, if not automate. Um, and so I see a future of work where there will be fewer people having jobs. And there's another factor there too. We are in an era in which there is a belief in bigger government and more government mandates on employers, whether it be to pay for healthcare or rights of workers or whatever. So the cost of hiring, and it's quite difficult for an employer to get rid of somebody who's not good. And so there are additional pressures for employers to not hire. So all that conspires to mean that there'll be many millions of people who are not going to be employable in any significant way, at least sustainably over their lifetime. So what is that going to, there is certainly it's easy to state a negative scenario, massive civil unrest, poverty, robberies, and all that. But there is a positive one that I wanted to share. And the positive scenario is that people will come to recognize the limitations on the value of materialism. They won't care about buying new cars. They may not even, they might drive, they might even try to go without a car and do in certain warm climates in a moped or a bicycle. They might, instead of aspiring to the 3,000-foot house with a picket fence in a quote good neighborhood, they'll be happy to live in the 500 square feet, or at least satisfied, recognizing that true happiness does not come from that materialism. I know a lot of rich people, very rich people, and they're not happy. In fact, they feel burdened by all their wealth and the materialism and worrying about people trying to, chop at them or whatever. But that there may be people who recognize in this, if they can't make money, they will find their happiness through relationships, through creative outlet, whether it be writing or music or sports or whatever, and that ultimately, and there'll be less cheating. Wealth leads, I don't know what causes what first, chicken and egg thing, but there's a hell of a lot of businesses and nonprofits, frankly, that try to screw people. They have these salespeople out there to try to get you to donate. So my point is, if we are in a less materialistic society, there may be yet greater net happiness because we'll find our contentment from our kindness, from our relationships, and from our creative outlets. What's your reaction to that?
I agree with you totally. I've co-authored a couple books during COVID with a woman named Diana Handel, and she was the CEO of a hospital, Long Beach Memorial Hospital, when an employee of the month came in and killed his two supervisors and himself, and she led the hospital through that. And one of the things she talked about how the hospital recovered is she said, when we discovered a purpose and a sense of community that we kind of connected to each other, that's what really pulled us out of this. Because and I think it goes to what you're speaking, is if we can have a non-materialistic purpose in life and a sense of community, I think it can pull us past that. The problem is, and I'm a little bit down on the tech giant CEOs because and there's a person, if you don't know this person, I would recommend you read everything he's written, Martin Lindstrom. And he has a book about something about common sense, but I've heard him speak recently. And what he talked about in a very calm way, I mean, you would just like how informed he is in the research. He said, basically, the pursuit of the algorithm has killed off the ability to empathize.
Mm.
That people pursue algorithms that go stepwise to stepwise to stepwise because it seems efficient. You can measure it. You can measure the end result. And he said it's killing off empathy because empathy requires a slowing down your mind and being interested in basically the well-being of another person, not what they're achieving, not what their result is, not. And he says that he didn't have any recommendations. It was just sort of a warning. So I agree with you totally, but I think there needs to be a discovery of, what it is. I think people need to discover how much more satisfying fulfillment is than gratification. Because as long as people are focused on gratification, immediate gratification, what's going to happen is the adrenaline is going to always eclipse oxytocin, which is closeness. Adrenaline is excitement. Years ago, I throw a little bit of neuroscience here. If dopamine is connected to pleasure, years ago, adrenaline has always led to pleasure because of its excitement, danger. But once upon a time, something called oxytocin also led to dopamine because feeling close to another person, feeling tender, feeling kindly and being kindly actually was pleasurable. But what Martin Lindstrom's talking about is it takes too much time. So it's no longer pleasurable, and it seems to take too much time to emotionally care about connecting to people. What do you think of that?
I want to present what I think is, I'll just offer this macro concept. What you're talking about is the importance of the concept of we, not me, community. You use the word community a number of times. I'd like to provide what I believe is, I'll be honest, I'll be guilty of hubris, a wiser position, which is more balanced. I think excess I, and I wish I could remember the Hillel quote, if I'm only for me, I'm nothing. If I'm only for somebody else, then what good is it? I do think that the wise approach is a balance of I and we.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to have a certain amount of I in order to motivate you to act. And you're entitled to some measure of reaping the rewards that your efforts have. It's not just about giving, giving, giving. I've seen plenty of people give, and end up getting depressed because they don't reap significant rewards. On the other hand, yes, if you're too selfish and it's all about you, whether it be materialistic, or if all day, forget about materialism, if all day I played the piano, it would not be, it would be a frittering of my life. I do need to devote my efforts elsewhere. So even when I play the piano, I make YouTube videos so that people can hear them. I'm always thinking about the balance between what's good for me and others. And I think right now we are denigrating the I in favor of community, all in together. If you watch TV commercials, watch the news, read, it's all about we together, all in. And I think that we've learned from the Soviet Union and all the Soviet bloc countries and Angola and Mozambique and Venezuela and Cuba, that too much of a focus on the we leads to such demotivation and long breadlines and riots. So I think what we need is a valuing, a valorizing of community, but also an honoring of the individual.
I completely agree. In fact, I'm going to be working with people about something is happening with women in the workforce. They're abandoning the workforce. Something's happened, and they're going to lose some ground that they've achieved. And one of the approaches that we're going to take, and it doesn't just suit women, it suits everyone, is in a well-lived life, nothing should compete for importance. All your roles, including your role of being self-concerned, are important, but they all compete for time.
Yep.
And when you drag one role into the next, when you drag work to home so nobody gets your attention, or home into work so you're not keeping up with the results you're supposed to generate. So the whole idea is how to be able to segue completely and give your undivided attention to each of the roles and let go of the prior one, because when you're not fully present, you're shortchanging everyone, including yourself. And part of what we may talk about, one of my coaches who fought an uphill battle trying to help me, he said, we always guard our calendars, because when you calendar something, it's a commitment to yourself, commitment to someone else. And so if you can calendar times for the I, calendar times for the we, calendar times for whatever role, but learn to be totally present and learn how to leave the prior role without ticking off the other person, because you actually have to go and function in this other role because you have a commitment, that maybe there is a way to do that. I think busy attorneys are able to go from one file to the next, to the next, to the next, because cases take forever. But when you go from one case to the next, especially when you're talking billable hours, you got to be totally focused in that next role. And there may be, and I don't know if this is true, but there may be a skill in when you're, like, I'm a grandparent, and when I'm with my children, my grandchildren, I want to be completely present, which means pushing away all of the fun things that I'm doing in my professional life, because otherwise I look distracted. Otherwise I look like I'd rather be somewhere else. And I don't want to do that. So I'm trying to develop that muscle of being present wherever I am. What do you think of that?
You said you've been largely, your own coach has been not successful in helping you do that. I want to give you some absolution here. Yes, there are times you want to be absolutely fully present with somebody, especially if you're talking about something important. But for example, I speak with my wife, and very often we're talking on the phone and she's folding laundry or doing whatever. Yes, I would prefer she didn't do that. But I recognize, hopefully as not too childish a person, that that the net benefit, she's still paying plenty of attention to me. And like even when you and I are talking, you're the author of Just Listen. But I know, I would guess, I'm making it, maybe I'm not, you'll tell me, that while you're talking, you're not just listening to me, you're also, part of your brain is thinking about, what am I going to say next? What is going to be next? So I think that multitasking is given too black and white a bad reputation. I think it's situational. How much can you multitask at a given time? Where is the benefit outweigh? I mean, that's to me one of the hallmarks of intelligence is nuance, is knowing it's not black and white thinking, whether you're politically on the left or the right. It's nuance, it's situational, whether when you're talking about climate change, or you're talking about a relationship, it's all about nuance. So there are times I will, for example, when I with some clients and I'm on a phone, I might indeed pull weeds, but I'm actually better while I'm pulling weeds because I'm not. They say that your brain works better when you're moving. So I think we need to have a more nuanced look at the value and limitations of multitasking. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Look, when I'm going for a walk, that's an activity. But when I go for a walk, that's when I do some of my best thinking. It's not like there are some people who say, well, you shouldn't be thinking. You should be aware of the environment. You should be enjoying the palm trees. You should
Right.
be enjoying the sky. I don't even notice them.
Right.
So I think, look, everything you've said has made incredible sense, is appreciated. And uh, and to our listeners, you don't have the benefit of a continuous conversation with Marty that I do, uh, but you can find out more if you just check out where to find him, and he's going to tell us right now.
Actually, with your permission. This conversation has been essentially completely ad libbed on. We talked about a couple of topics we talk about, but um, I like to end every talk I give with one story, and it's not because I promised my father that I would, but because I believe it's something that is quite important that we haven't yet covered. So may I take 2 minutes to tell a
Yes,
story?
yes,
More important than telling him how you can find out more about Marty Nemko. The year is 1939. The town is Sierpz, Poland. My father lived with his parents in a bucolic town. They didn't even lock the doors. And one day there was a knock on the door, and it was two Nazis in black boots. And unlike in the movies, they didn't yell. One was silent, and the other whispered. You will be out of your house with only what you can carry on your back by noon tomorrow or else. And the next day, there weren't two Nazis, there were 12. And this time they were yelling. And they went into all the Jewish households and said, Raus! And grabbed them all and threw all the Jews who were young and able-bodied in one truck and all the old in another. And in the end, my father never saw any of his family again. He and 39 men, or 56 men, I'm not sure, were among the people who escaped, dug a tunnel to escape from the Panari death camp, where he then lived, thanks to the good Christians, in the Black Forest until he was dropped on a cargo boat in New York. He had no money, no English, no education, no nothing, only the scars of the Holocaust tortures. What did he do? No job was beneath him. His first job was sewing shirts in a factory in Harlem. And when he came home at night, he didn't say, I'm exhausted, I'm a Holocaust survivor, I'm going to go and get drunk. He went to Roosevelt Night School to learn English, where he met my mom, who was also a Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz. And on Saturday, did he say, I'm exhausted, I'm a Holocaust survivor, I'm going to watch Saturday morning football? No. He went to the owner of the factory where he sold the shirts, and he said, could I buy these shirts for $1 and sell them for $1.50 out of a cardboard box on the streets? And he did. What did he do with the money? Did he say, oh, I entitled some pleasures, some material, I'm going to buy stuff? No. He saved up so he could move my mom, my sister, and I from the tenement that we lived in the Bronx, right where the elevated train was roaring 24/7, unair conditioned, fourth floor walk up, to something better. We grew up. We then moved to eventually to Flushing, Queens, and Anyway, but bottom line is, he used the money for the first and last month's rent on the only store he could afford, 105 Moore Street in Brooklyn, still one of the worst neighborhoods. And when I was 12 or so, the store was so small, he had to have all the merchandise out on folding tables, or most of it. And it was, like I said, a tough neighborhood. And so on the weekends, the kids would come by and steal whole boxes of shirts and stuff. And so he couldn't afford a security guard. So when I was 12 or 13, I became the security guard, quote. It didn't deter anybody. Neither did my father really want me to. He just said, stand there. But anyway, the most memorable moment of my life to this day was one day when business was slow, and out in front of the store, my dad and I were standing out there, and there was a parking meter right in front. And I remember having my elbow on one side of it and my father having his elbow on the other. And I said, I finally awakened from the egocentrism of childhood. And I said, Daddy, how come you so rarely talk about the Holocaust? And he stiffened, which is something he rarely did. And he said, Martin, the Nazis took 5 years from my life. I won't give them 1 minute more. He said, Martin, never look back. Always take the next step forward. And each and every one of us has had crap happen to us. Fortunately, not as bad as what happened to my father. And yet I have been privileged to have been career coach to some of the most successful people on planet Earth, as well as to some real strugglers. And one of the big differentiators is that the successful ones, they failed a lot, but they ended up following my advice. Never look back, always take the next step forward. And I can leave you with no better advice.
Wow. Uh, Thank you for sharing that. Um, all I could do was just listen because it was so worth listening to. So I'm kind of speechless. So while I'm being speechless, why don't you take over and tell people about where they can find you?
Well, people tend to, cherry pick and give you, why just Google me? You'll find my thousands of articles, my books, whatever, everything from careers for dummies to what's the big idea, 39 inventions, reinventions for a better America, and information on counseling stuff. I still love doing my counseling. So just Google Marty, Martynemko.
Thank you. Thank you for this interview, and thank you. I'm proud to call you my friend.
Same here.
And,
It's a pleasure.
and to our listeners, thank you for listening in. This has been a real pleasure for me. I guess I was expecting it to go pretty well, but it went very well for me. I hope you had a similar experience from the beginning through the middle to the end, to his story about his dad and always looking forward. I think that's a good wake up call for all of you who are listening in. When you wake up, maybe you can learn from the past, but don't date it. Always look forward and keep moving forward. So thanks for listening in. And it helps if you write a review to tell us about what we can do better, who you'd like to see on the program. And until next time, this is Mark saying, whenever the next wake up call comes, see if you can catch it.